This is the latest in a series of events that have been going on since about a year ago, actually, coming out of our Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project. It's so lovely to get money on something like this, some research money. Clean Break, Women, Theatre, Organisation and the Criminal Justice System. And our umbrella title for the project is Women, Theatre, Justice. It's an interdisciplinary project led by Caoimhe McAvinci of Queen Mary, University of London, and Sarah Bartley of University of Reading, who's here, and being stage manager for today. And Caoimhe and Sarah are from Theatre and Performance Studies, and then Deborah Dean at the University of Warwick and me at the University of Leicester in Work and Employment Relations. For those of you who don't know, and I'm sure it needs no introduction really, but Clean Break is a theatre company working with women with experience of the criminal justice system. And we are working in partnership with Clean Break in this research project, exploring it as a women-only organisation, which has recently changed its business and operating model and in terms of its theatre practices and impact on the arts and criminal justice sectors. Clean Break was initiated by women in HMP Askham Grange in 1977 and has since become an internationally recognised theatre, education and advocacy organisation that places stories of women, crime and punishment centre stage. The aim of our project is to develop new understandings about Clean Break's impact on contemporary British theatre, its unusual organisational approach of learning through trying to listen to voices involved in its work, and how this practice can inform policy and practitioner discussions about organisational leadership in arts and criminal justice. The project has just been such a privilege to work on it, I have to say. It involves a mixture of interviews with a range of Clean Break stakeholders, past and current staff, members, external partners, organisations. We've also engaged in observation at management and board meetings over a 4-month, 5-month, 6-month period over 2020, including over the very unusual period of the COVID pandemic. And that's been a real privilege to see Clean Break working in action during that time. The project's also funded a tour of a Clean Break production, Sweatbox by Chloe Moss, which featured 3 members of Clean Break set in a decommissioned prison van. The tour was cut short because of COVID and is now a film directed by one of the company's joint artistic directors, Anna Herman, who I saw her name, she is here, which is being launched formally in June. Through this project, seminars, conferences, exhibitions, podcasts and publications, we're exploring wider issues, including the criminalisation of women, theatre practices with incarcerated women in different cultural contexts, and the implications of COVID-19 for incarcerated women in the response of arts organisations. This morning, our focus is related to a particular strand of the project on gender, organisation and leadership. These things have been at the centre of our research inquiry at Clean Break, and on which we'll be writing up analysis over the next years in the future. And one of the main things that we're talking about today is how Clean Break works as a women-only organisation. What, if anything, does this mean for the way that management works, how decisions are made, how voice and power functions? How does the mission and cause of Clean Break's work impact the way it organises itself? Is Clean Break unusual? And does the way it works have any reflections for us or implications for the wider sector in which it works? We have 2 fantastic speakers this morning who couldn't be more qualified to discuss these issues. Erin Gavaghan is Executive Director of Clean Break, one of the 3 who comprise the organisation's joint decision-making senior leadership team. Erin, who came to the UK from Canada more than 20 years ago, came to Clean Break bringing a wealth of experience as an executive arts manager, having previously worked with the Siobhan Davis Dance, Soho Theatre and at the Royal Albert Hall. Gill Kirton is Professor of Employment Relations and the Centre for Research in Equality and Diversity at the School of Business and Management at Queen Mary, University of London. Gill's carried out many research projects in the area of gender and equality in unions, with a particular interest in gender democracy, women's organising and women's groups, so perfectly placed to talk today. Before becoming an academic as well, Gill was in the real world, worked for around 10 years in non-profit women's organisations, campaigning, researching and writing on women's issues in the workplace, and working in partnership with trade union women's groups to deliver activist training. After Erin and Gill have spoken separately for about 15-20 minutes each, they will then be chairing a discussion between them. We'll then have a short break, and when we return, it would be really nice to get into some breakout rooms so we can have some small group discussions and reflections on what's been discussed this morning and what you have to say in relation to your own experience in organisations. As I said earlier, your microphones should be muted for the first part of the event, but we hope you'll write comments in the chat space and ask any questions that you want to put to Erin or Gill or both. So now I'm going to finish and hand over to you, Erin.
Thank you very much. Great introduction. I'm Erin. I'm a white woman in her mid-40s with freckles, a very short red blonde hair, and I'm wearing a black top. I'm sitting in a pale green and grey room with a peach banner behind me that says clean break, just for anyone who needs audio description. This invitation to speak about our organisational practices and shared leadership has proven to be quite the challenge. I've thought a lot about it in relation to our leadership team, which is the team that I joined 2 years ago, but to expand that thinking to clean break more widely, which is a very relevant consideration as we're thinking of the future rather than managing through pandemic. It's really valuable to think of the advantages and wondering how to strengthen these, while also acknowledging that there are some challenges, as always arise. For those of you who are new to Clean Break, I will share some context as it is the heart of where our shared leadership comes from. We are a women's theatre company changing lives and minds on stage, in prison, and in the community. Clean Break was founded in 1979 by 2 women prisoners who believed in the power of theatre to change lives. Their legacy is very present in our work today. We're celebrating our 40-year history with an exhibition this June and July at Swiss Cottage Gallery looking at the heritage of Clean Break as a radical theatre company. Because we produce groundbreaking theatre which puts women's voices at its heart and creates lasting change by challenging injustice in and beyond the criminal justice system. Most recently, pre-pandemic, we had productions at the Donmar Warehouse and Royal Court Theatre in London, but we also tour nationally and we aim to take our place to women in prison wherever possible. Through theatre workshops and projects in prison, the community, and in our specialist centre in London, we help to build confidence, resilience, and well-being, transforming the lives of women who've experienced the criminal justice system or who are at risk of entering it by using theatre-based activities to improve these well-being indicators. Beyond the programme, by creating opportunities in the arts, we help to break down the barriers that women face working in the arts, creating new and more diverse progression routes into the industry and into education for women. Our all-female casts and creative teams create a range of opportunities for women in all aspects of production and help to address the underrepresentation of women behind the scenes in the UK theatre industry. 2 key things that shape leadership at Clean Break are being a women-only organisation and centering service users or participants within the company. As a women-only organisation, from participants to staff to artists and trustees, I know Gill will be speaking on some of the aspects of women-only organisations, so I will touch only on ours briefly. We believe that the physical and emotional safety offered in a gender-specific and trauma-informed space like Clean Break is a key benefit. Our members are the women we work with and support through our work. They have a lived experience of the criminal justice system or are at risk of offending due to specific indicators. Women who are caught up in the criminal justice system have a range of complex and gender-specific needs, including drug and alcohol use, domestic violence, mental distress, or housing issues, and are often at the intersection of multiple identities, being race, gender, and ethnicity. In combination with poverty and class, they are some of the most acutely disadvantaged individuals in modern day society. The Women's Resource Centre summarised in their publication, Why Women Only, that women in women-only spaces feel more supported and comfortable. They become empowered and develop confidence, greater independence, and high self-esteem. They are less marginalised and isolated and feel more able to express themselves. Women using these services feel their voices are heard and listened to, and through sharing experiences with other women to make sense of the world together, they develop a sense of solidarity. This manifests at Clean Break not only with our members, but I also see this in our staff team. deeply committed to our mission and values, the solidarity is very strong in our team. And whether we attract women who also have complex needs, or whether our environment is set for them to reveal them, we do have staff who say that they have felt more safe in disclosing challenges that they face in life with us than they have in other employment. And while we have those who don't, it is something we are working on and wanting our team to bring their whole selves to work and trust us to respect that. I will admit, I was a little unsure when joining the team, as I had never worked in a purposefully gender-specific space or team before, although my experience working in the arts in London has been with predominantly female teams. When I check myself, I realized that there is a lot of stigma around groups of women being together that I've actually never experienced. I felt like I'd come home into a comfortable and welcoming space when I started work at Clean Break. It was difficult to pinpoint, but that feeling of being able to be myself more authentically was so present, and that has been sustained through the years I've been there. There is something quite liberating in being in this environment, and I find myself noticing the benefits in small ways that add up to a caring and compassionate culture at work. Our values are very present in the everyday interactions as well as in our work, which of course means that alongside that supportive and nurturing side to things, we are also empowered, we champion courage, and as a learning organization, embrace change. As leaders, we try to own our mistakes to strengthen how we work collaboratively. And these are not exclusively values or behaviors of women, but in my experience, they are more present in this environment than in any other I have professionally experienced. As time goes on, this environment prompts me to question some of the leadership traits and behaviors that I thought were good or right, and wonder if there are more feminist approaches to leadership that center empathy in people that are stronger. A phrase that is repeated most often at Clean Break is members at the heart. Theirs are the stories and voices we amplify, and our approach centers them within everything that is Clean Break. They were consulted in the revisioning of the organization that was launched in 2018, asking for more theatre connection and renewing the company's identity as a theatre company. The shift from being students and graduates of an education program to being members at the heart of a theatre company is significant to the way we work now. Our integrated model seeks to embed members across the entire artistic program as participants, as artists, as audiences. However, I would like to focus on how we embed them in our organizational practice and where we are heading to strengthen this. In addition to seeking feedback from our members as service users or participants through evaluation and regular contact with our members' support team, we aim to embed them in our consultations and decision-making through a members' advisory group. It is one of the challenges of the last 2 years that this does not yet feel as successful as its potential. We've had to recognize that our capacity to improve this is stretched. So we are in the process of engaging a consultant to review our progress and to support us with a deeper embedding of the members' involvement in our decision-making over the next year. The commitment of our team to this is without question, but faced with all of the challenges in the last year, we needed to consider another route to make this happen. Where we have had some success with this is in our governance. Our board have long championed having women with lived experience at the table to inform their strategic guidance of the company. And in 2019, this included appointing 2 trustees who were also members. This felt like a great moment to me, but I am also aware that there was a sense of this having taken a long time to achieve. And it's really important to acknowledge to those of us who are new in a company that while change can feel very progressive, we need to understand the history to place it in the context and know the investment that has come before in order to realize it. We are currently working with Beyond Suffrage on a lived experience training program for trustees to support increasing this level of representation in other charities as well as our own. It feels vital that we share our experience and our leadership with others outside of our organization and champion this value of lived experience. Shared leadership is central to Clean Break's organizational practice and manifests in many ways. The first is how we strive to bring our members into our decision-making processes. This is a journey and we don't have it right all the time, but we consider them within all of our plans and include them more as we learn. Organisationally, our structure is one of shared leadership. Following a period of organisational change, a new structure was implemented in the summer of 2018. The company moved away from having a single CEO, being the wonderful Lucy Perman, who I believe is with us today, to a shared leadership model of having an executive director, myself, and two joint artistic directors, Anna Herman and Roisin McBrien, and we are referred to as the leadership team. I had some previous experience of working in this way of a team of three. However, the main difference at Clean Break is the balance of responsibility. It is very important that we are equal. We are jointly responsible as CEO for the organisation and equally responsible to the board for the executive management of the charity. We work the same number of hours and we are paid the same. We do not job share, but we work collaboratively together to fulfill jointly held responsibilities as well as areas where we have specific experience with. What I appreciated in the beginning was the support that was offered to us to create a compact, something that was quite new for me. First, we worked with the board to discuss how we would work with them. And then with a change coach, the leadership team explored how we would bring together our very different ways of working into a new team. These compacts allow us to have clarity from the outset, understanding the expectations and setting the tone of open dialogue to ensure that we could challenge each other and support in equal measure. Working in a consultative and collaborative way with so many voices to be heard takes time. It took us time to work out how we could work together, with the added challenge that both Anna and Roisin had held previous roles in the organisation and needed to take on a new role while letting go of aspects of the old. They additionally had to create an artistic partnership. We invested in our relationship and weathered a few crises to get to the position we are in now. Not always smooth, but that is how a relationship develops. I would offer us as a successful leadership team. We don't always agree, and in point of fact, our diversity of opinion is one of our strengths. We listen and challenge while supporting and championing each other, and being a sounding board has immeasurable value. But in this process of creating a tight three-woman team and focusing on our leadership, there was a drift with our senior management team, who previously had one leader and felt clarity of their roles within decision-making. With three at the helm, and sometimes difficult times, it meant our decision-making circle shrank, and the shared leadership of the six of us became muddy. Clarity of responsibility is essential, and there is a challenge in stepping back to ensure that leadership can come from others. At the heart of our management team of six, there was respect and care, and with some coaching support, we have been able to come together, work through our issues, and create our own compact. This process was uncomfortable at times, but the investment in our relationship and the open conversation has improved our working together. We are more vocal and honest with our views, and this in turn strengthens the work that we do and support across the organization. A colleague noted this week that we often feel time poor. And I think that in a shared leadership structure that incorporates many voices, it is a precious thing that there is never enough of. More people do equate more meetings and more complex diaries, and it can be frustrating to realize that even though our whole team is small, being only 20, it is difficult to get us all together. Add to this a high level of part-time working, and it is very tricky indeed at times. Pace is another challenge that I link very much to time. An example is that over the past 6 months, we've been on a journey of learning around our aim to become an anti-racist organization. In a moment born of the desire to be proactive and engage in positive change, we got our pace wrong. We, the leadership team, offered a draft action plan to our team at a time when they wanted consultation and space to talk about their experience of racism. We are still learning to shift our pace to that of those with experience, and the leadership often has to come from within. Our role at the top is to make that space, respond to the need, and help make things happen. It's easier for fewer people to make a decision and steer a ship, but for us, this runs the danger of missing something or neglecting a perspective. We're in the process of relearning what our planning pace needs to be to ensure that all of our stakeholders can contribute and be part of decisions. We're also trying to learn where consultation may not always be necessary. We want to empower leadership to come in many forms, but we also recognize that not everything is better when it's decided by a full committee. Delegation with responsibility and autonomy is how we empower others to find their strength, make their own mistakes, and find their leadership qualities. Communication is another thing that we continually need to work on. It's very challenging to lead with one voice when there are actually three, and our internal communication is not always quite hitting the mark. We feel this is improving, and then through remote working, we are startled at times to realize our messaging has not landed. I've yet to meet anyone who's cracked the nut of great internal communication in an organization, but I remain ever hopeful. One of the most fundamental advantages of working in this way that I value is that it is far less lonely. The burdens are shared, as are the joys, and there is an opportunity to reflect to your peers their strengths in a way that many executives lack as a resource. The messages of support that I received this morning ahead of this presentation made me feel seen and valued. My experience to date has been that of, in a leadership role, that this affirmation often has to come from within. But as humans, we also need this reflected to us. There's space to take care of ourselves as well as others and to recognize the value of this when the leadership is shared. Participating in research, as this project has been just that, a reflecting of who Clean Break are and how we work, taking the time to see through others' eyes and understand the unique and valuable traits of our organization that we may take for granted has helped strengthen our leadership even further. So for me, shared leadership is incredible. It's a positive and fruitful partnership that yields a better result than the often lonely at the top picture of the past. And including a multitude of diverse voices is enriching and worth the extra time and effort that's required. Slowing down to listen and take notice is a lesson I'm learning reaps great reward as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Erin, for that wonderfully frank and honest and personal reflection on your place and the way that Clean Break works. Thank you. So many things to discuss, which we'll come to later. For now, I'd like to turn to our second speaker, Gill Kirton.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thanks so much to the project organisers for inviting me to talk today. It's been a really interesting experience reflecting back on my own previous work experience in women-only organisations and joining that together with my academic research. And I really enjoyed listening to you, Erin, too. That was really interesting and took me back to that work experience, and with some nostalgia, I have to say. So I won't say too much about my work and research background because Anne-Marie gave me that very nice introduction. So you can see that my time of working in non-profit women's organisations was a long time ago now, and it spanned from about 1986 through to 1997. So I'm sure things have changed in that space in the time that, you know, I've been away from it, but I haven't been entirely away from it because I've also have, you know, about 20 years of experience working on women's organisations, particularly in unions, but also in some other places as well that I'll mention today. I have a little bit of experience of or knowledge of the criminal justice system through the work I've done with the main probation union, NAPO. So I just mentioned that as part of the background. So could you go to the next slide, please? So I'm not going to talk much about academic and theorisation of women-only spaces today, but I just wanted to lay on the table some authors that have been key for me in terms of influencing my understanding of my own personal experience of working in women-only organisations, and also of the women-only organisations that I've researched. And so some key concepts for me are around feminism, and around gender equality and gender oppression, and more recently, what we now frame as intersectionality and women's empowerment. So if I could go to the next slide, please. So one thing when I was reflecting on this, and a point that I felt was important to make, is that Erin's already indicated that when women organise together, it's often treated and seen as something unusual and perhaps slightly suspicious. But in fact, women's organisations are not at all unusual, and we can find them in a broad spectrum of social domains. It's quite surprising, and I think even this list is not exhaustive. I think there are other types of women's organisations that I haven't listed here in different spaces. I've highlighted in bold the ones that I've had the most experience of, which are professional and business women's networks through research, women's rights and advocacy organisations through my own work experience, and trade union women's groups through my research. So I think, there are many different types as well within this, in terms of orientation. So not all women's organisations are radical, progressive or feminist. Some of them quite the opposite. Next slide, please. And partly they differ because there are different motivations as to why women do and should organise separately. And two primary motivations that the historical literature identifies. And the first is around a narrative about women's essential difference and the existence of feminine traits that women possess. And so, within this narrative, which draws clearly here on gender stereotypes, women are fixed as inherently different from men with different characteristics, which produce different interests and which are best pursued from within women-only spaces. So we might see this reflected in some voluntary societies, women's organisations, National Housewives Register, I think it's changed its name now to National Women's Register, those kinds of organisations. But, and these are often about the idea that we need to maintain separate domains in order to maintain the gender order that is seen as natural. Next slide, please. And the second primary motivation is around feminist grievances. And so when I talk about, and when other authors talk about feminist grievances, we're not defining this as about victimhood as such, in the way that some critics of traditional feminism, like some current government ministers, for example, in the way that they talk about feminism, but rather about drawing attention to gendered hierarchies and practices in social institutions, in organisations that work to marginalise and exclude women, particularly from power. And, there can be many different ways in which feminist grievances can be pursued, and it's not necessarily only through campaigning and advocacy. And we can see this in the example of the clean break that we're talking about this morning. These organisations don't necessarily have an espousedly feminist identity. They don't necessarily shout about feminism, but I think we can classify certain women's organisations as feminist for analytical purposes. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So I just wanted to illustrate with women's voices from my own research these two narratives. So the narrative of women's essential difference, a member of a business women's network said this: I think equality up to a point. There's a reason why men and women are different. I don't think we should be the same. That's equality gone too far. I mean, we are wired up differently in our brains. We are creative, intuitive, nurturing, giving. Men are logical, rational, action-oriented. The balance must be maintained. This isn't the only time that I heard this kind of narrative being talked about in the many, many women that I've interviewed who are part of women's organisations. The other narrative of feminist grievances, illustrated by a woman from a trade union women's group, If women can get together and develop an agenda, then it will bring out women's issues, because there are still barriers for women. So at least if we can get our agenda clear, then we can get through the barriers that are set up by men. And I think that's, you know, clearly a feminist grievance narrative. Next slide, please. So why do women join women-only organisations as participants, service users, recipients, depending on the type of organisation? And I think to find the answer to this, we need to look beyond those essentialist and binary narratives about women. So beyond the iconic images of burned bras in the UK and purple dungarees in Germany that comes from. So in some cases, it's about social and professional support and friendship. Other times it's not necessarily because men are excluded per se, but because the organisation is pursuing some kind of woman-centred aim. But I think, you know, Erin hinted at this. So I'm not sure if you use this expression explicitly, Erin, but women's groups offer a safe space. And it's a safe space from physical male violence that many women will have experienced, many service users and recipients will have experienced, but it's also from symbolic male violence that I'll speak a little bit about in a moment. And so there's that space that exists for shared learning, reflection, personal development in that space with women with similar lived experiences. Next slide, please. So I wanted to say a little bit more about safe spaces for women, because this is a concept that I've used quite a lot in my research. And so women-only spaces can feel literally safe because men are not there and are not admitted and cannot perpetrate violence against women within that space physically, but also symbolically. Men are not there undermining women with different micro behaviours and aggressions, like interrupting, appropriating women's ideas and taking credit for women's contributions and achievements. And I've sat in many meetings in my university where that has occurred. And I think this is a common experience for women. And so to get to the women-only space and not experience that in that kind of undermining way can feel very liberating and empowering. And so, you know, basically we're back to the problem of women being underrepresented in the most powerful positions in organisations where they're not able to challenge those kinds of micro aggressions that occur. You know, this has been popularised by the term mansplaining nowadays. So the safe space isn't merely a shelter from physical male violence, but also a kind of sanctuary where personal growth can occur. Next slide, please. So again, to illustrate with some voices from women that I've interviewed, the first one from a woman from a union women's group talks about there not being a competitive element in the women-only space. Because if you're not careful, men, will take advantage in all sorts of subtle psychological ways. They do like to think they're better than everybody else, and it gets very wearing after a while. And then the second woman who participated in a women-only training course in a union talked about that self-confidence and that empowerment, and about meeting women in so many different types of situations, but still feeling that there was a kind of gender solidarity that developed within that women-only space. Next slide, please. And so Erin talked quite a bit about what I would call the principles of managing and leading women's organisations. So I'll just go through this fairly quickly. Being run by women as a women's organisation serving women is not always accepted as a given. And why exclude women is something that's talked about quite a lot. And I've done some research in the US, and there women's organisations often do have men somewhere in the background, not necessarily front and centre, but often men are controlling things like the budget, or there is a chairman in a women's organisation who is a man. And so, you know, this is a problematic for women's organisations sometimes. You know, it's not a given. But there is a strong belief, you know, particularly I think in the UK, that serving women means being run by women. They're often collectives. Internal democracy and consensus decision making are very important. There's often an avoidance of bureaucracy and hierarchy, flat managerial structures, and some kind of means of empowering users or service recipients, and also some means of providing accountability. So next slide, please. But with all of this comes some dilemmas that I want to highlight. And so within women's organisations, the very concept of managing and leading may be contested. The more collective approaches to managing the organisation may be preferred, but there are all kinds of problems that come with this. It can make decision-making painfully slow and also fraught with interpersonal difficulties. The literature has talked about the tyranny of leaderlessness, and this can engulf organisations where leaders are lacking and where leadership is not accepted in an ideological way. Decision-making can be intensely political, with lots of mobilising going on behind the scenes. Getting everyone on board with decisions that are reached by consensus can be surprisingly difficult. So you can go away from a meeting having achieved supposedly consensus, but not everyone will abide by the consensus decision. Another problem that can occur for people working in this space is that the collectivist management system can lead to a lack of recognition for individual achievements. And this can be a problem if you're trying to develop a career in these types of organisations, because when you go for interviews, everyone wants to know, what did you contribute? Not so much what did the organisation do, but what did you do and contribute? And it can be quite hard to show that. Next slide, please. So the dislike for hierarchy and hierarchical relations can pose some operational problems. In a way, hierarchy is quite straightforward and simple as a means of determining power relations in organisations. And in its absence, we need to think about, where does power lie? Who's entitled to power? And although in theory, in collectives, power is evenly distributed, collectives can become dysfunctional, and it can take quite some time to resolve disagreements among staff and management. It can make it difficult to deal with poor job performance, neglect of duties, and all the other managerial problems that are relatively straightforward to deal with within a hierarchical system. Formal hierarchy may be replaced by informal ones, by moral authority, rather than positional authority. But the question is, who has moral authority? And certainly in the organisations that I worked with during that 10-year time period, there was a question around hierarchies of oppression. And you may have come across that idea that even within the group women, not everybody is equally oppressed, and who is the most oppressed. And we spent a lot of time discussing those issues. Next slide, please. So members of women's organisations and groups don't agree on everything. And I suppose in a way that was quite a surprise to me when I started as a young woman working, not long out of university, working in women's organisations. It was quite a surprise to me, the amount of disagreement over lots of different issues, despite there being some fundamental agreement around, you know, women's inequality and the need to address that. And so those differences of opinion are often rooted in a variety of social backgrounds, ethnicity, race, sexual orientations, class, and so on. And any one organisation can encompass many different identities that intersect with gender. And so intersectionality is now increasingly recognised, but it also must be operationalised. And what does it mean for us as a women's organisation and our purpose, and how can we pursue it in practical ways that become meaningful? Why do we continue to exclude men? That's often a question that is an ongoing one within women's organisations. And these issues can impact on the organisation's purpose and its priorities, as well as the way it operates and delivers its services. Next slide, please. So just coming to the end, some final thoughts about women's organisations, which, you know, although I've presented some dilemmas, I am firmly in favour of, having worked in them and researched them. But I have seen some of these problems occurring and the difficulties of resolving some of them. So what would happen if we allowed men into woman-centred organisations and groups? And, you know, there are often two main positions. And the first is that women's organising should always be considered temporary until such time as specific goals are met. This may be long-term temporary, it could be decades. You know, it's not necessarily a short-term aim, but the goal from this perspective would always be for gender integration ultimately. And the second perspective is that women's organisation will always be necessary, and it should just be accepted and recognised as a permanent strategy for serving women and working towards gender equality in different social spaces. And, you know, and overall, that's the one I would personally subscribe to, that women's organisations are necessary for different reasons in different social spaces. And I think, you know, at some high level of abstraction, they do contribute to improving women's lives, challenging gendered power relations in wider society, where women, you know, undoubtedly continue to have less say in mixed gender settings. So last slide, please. So voices of participants here. Two members of an American union women's organisation. It's quite well known over there and very long standing, established in the mid-1970s, called the Coalition of Labour Union Women. Men are allowed to join this organisation, even though it's for women and more or less run by women. Men are allowed to be there, mainly because the organisation is dependent on male sponsorship for funding. But it's very controversial as to whether they should be allowed in a meaningful way to help run the organisation. And there are very different views on this. And so a couple of women said to me, you get support from the men. They do understand it's a women's organisation. And then, shoot, they run everything else. We're not about to turn this over to them. So no, we're not going to let them in and let them run this organisation or even contribute in any substantial way to running it. I do think sometimes, I think it can be a little bit inhibiting on conversation to have men present at the meetings. Sometimes they do turn up, and sometimes they turn up for vexatious reasons. And so she goes on to say, I'm not going to say in every case, but I think there are some times when it makes for an awkward conversation when you're talking about women's issues. And so, you know, I think, you know, overall, my experience from my work and my research is that women's organisations need to be there, but we do need to confront the dilemmas and work out ways of resolving those as best we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gill. Right, just gonna, goodness, just gotta take a breath and take that all in. I was just wondering whether or not I could invite people just to take a moment to think about the things that have just been discussed. And if you feel like putting comments or questions in the chat, then please do so. I've added into the chat some questions that we'll be looking at, or to spark or provoke discussion within the breakout groups later on. So I've put them there perhaps as a starter. At this point, I don't know whether or not Erin or Gill, you had anything to say to each other, having heard each other's bits now, or had any initial reflections on how those two, I think you really were reflecting on each other, and there were such a lot of synergies between the things that you were saying.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me, because when I approached this, I realized I don't have that academic long-standing background in it, so I decided that I needed to keep my perspective from a very personal experience point of view, and just to hear some of that thinking reflected in the wealth of your experience, Gill, is really kind of empowering, and yeah, just really just fascinating to hear from a different arena. Yeah.
Yeah, and similarly for me, because you know, I don't have any knowledge of theatre and drama, and you know the synergies between, you know, the organisation that you work for and the ones that I've worked for in the past, and also the very different space of trade union women's groups. It is really amazing how much synergy there is between those different women-only spaces. And I suppose in thinking about it, I think really what's similar, underpinning them is basically a feminist orientation. That's how I would see it, because I think it's very different in other types of women's organisations that have the more conservative and less progressive agenda that I talked about earlier. You know, I was once asked to join an organisation called the Women's Housewives Register at the time, and I think it's changed its name now to the National Women's Register. And I said I had to decline the invitation on the basis that I didn't self-identify as a housewife. For a start, you know, I worked, but because I had small children, I was identified by some others as a housewife, even if I protested that I worked. And, you know, I felt that I couldn't join a women's organisation that had that kind of conservative agenda to preserve the house and the family as women's domain, and also that had a chairman that was and I thought there is absolutely no way I can join an organisation that has a chairman when it's an all-women organisation. So I think, you know, it's really about feminist values and about a progressive agenda.
I just wonder if I could ask Erin whether or not you think that the joint leadership model that you have in Clean Break, how unusual is that in the sector?
I think it's really, I don't know 100% is my honest sort of factual one. I think that in my experience, I have seen joint CEOs at the top of arts organizations. I think there are a growing number of joint artistic director roles that are coming to the fore. I feel like they're growing in prominence. To have 3 of us as joint CEO is not something that I'm aware of being in other organizations. In my previous organization, we did have a leadership team of 3, but we were not equal. Our artistic director and founder was the role of CEO. I was the executive director, and I held all of the business management, partly because she was often being a choreographer, and then we had a program director. So while we worked well together, there was a fundamental imbalance in that leadership structure. And for many, many years, we had a chairman above us. And when it came time to recruit for a new chair, we very, very vocally said, it feels like this needs to be a woman. And that was agreed. And it did change the dynamic quite substantially. But there's something about the balance of responsibility, because even in that previous triumvirate, very, very female, like I think there was only one man in our whole organization for most of the time, the weight of responsibility didn't feel necessarily evenly distributed the way that it really does at Clean Break. When we have had crises that are around the financial aspects of management, it would be natural for me, because that's my experience, to hold that. But actually it's really wonderful and empowering to have your artistic directors side by side with you through all of those. And I think that's what's been a real difference for us.
One of the things I thought came out of both of your talks was the notion of hierarchy and what place it plays within, I mean, I got kind of a sense from Jill when you were talking about a kind of an academic view on this, and that it would be one of the principles of a feminist or women-only organisation would often be that there would be very flat hierarchies, or that there would. But it seems to me that there is a hierarchy at Clean Break, and there is kind of in discussions that we've been having, it's that hierarchy isn't necessarily counterintuitive to democracy or voice necessarily, is it? It's like, it's not, they're not mutually exclusive. So I don't know if you had views on the importance or not of hierarchy, or the difficulties of hierarchy.
You want to go, Jill?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what I've thought about, a lot over the years is this question, and and the extent to which hierarchy, to some extent, simplifies decision making. It makes it clear where responsibility lies and who should be making what decisions, and sometimes it's also easier for other workers in the organisation, because it means you're not implicated in decisions like cuts, for example, and so it can feel, quite awkward to be in a collective where, cuts have to be made and it's going to affect someone's job. It might be one area and not others, and so on. So with the absence of hierarchy and the absence of it's like in industrial relations, I think we often talk about them and us, and there's them, the managers, and us, the workers, and that disappears if the flatter the hierarchy is within these types of non-profit organisations. And so it's when you have grievances as a worker, it's harder to apportion blame for those grievances, because you're collectively implicated in what's gone wrong. And so I think it poses many dilemmas for individuals as well as for the organisation to have an absence of hierarchy. But yet, at the same time, it's that absence of hierarchy that can make everybody feel that we've got to make this work somehow between us. And so we have to resolve our difficulties, whether they're interpersonal or more sort of structural and theoretical around inclusion of minority groups of women, whether sexual minorities or racial minorities and so on. We've somehow got to find a solution together, and everybody's responsible for doing that. So I don't think I have any, it's not like I can make a recommendation on that, but it is problematic that I think just continually needs to be confronted in collectivist organisations.
I think it is a bit of a dilemma, and I think that particularly for us, as we try to strengthen having our members very central to that decision making, it's bringing even more people into that consultation and decision making. We've got our staff, we've got a very, very committed and engaged board. It's physically quite a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so we're starting to think about how individuals could self-select for particular strands of work. And that's where the idea that consultation and collaboration doesn't necessarily have to be everyone all together all the time. It could break into smaller modules, but we're also highly conscious of not wanting to silo particular elements of work or make anyone feel a reduction of importance in those strands of work, because not everyone is involved in it. So there is a delicate balance, and I mean we're still learning and trialing, and I think it's got to be that iterative approach to find the way forward. Helps having a very impassioned team.
Thank you. I'm just very aware that it's 12 o'clock and we've been going for an hour, so I think it would probably be a good point at which to just have a bit of a 10-minute break, get a cup of tea, bit of a walk around, a comfort break, whatever. We'll come back and start again at 12:10. I know that Jen, you put a question in the chat and I have noted it, and we'll bring it up in terms of something for the breakout room discussions, and also for when we come back to talk as a group again. So thank you for that. So for now, just like turn off your cameras, turn off your microphones, go and have a bit of a break, have a bit of a think, and we'll come back and have a really good discussion together. All right, thanks.